start with the biggest headline in the world right now, America's banking crisis. It's a financial contagion, to be precise. Two banks have gone bust, two major banks back to back. They failed over the weekend. First, the Silicon Valley Bank, and then the Signature Bank. This one is based in New York. Yesterday, regulators had to shut it down. And these are America's biggest bank failures since 2008. You may remember the Lehman Brothers story of 2008. It triggered a global financial crisis. So the question is history repeating itself? Is another Lehman-like episode in the making? The bank closures have spooked the world. There are reports of steep losses. America's biggest banks have taken a hit. Last week, they lost a staggering $100 billion. On Vantage tonight, we'll tell you what happened, why it happened, and whether you should be worried. Wherever in the world you're watching us from, does it impact you? We start with the Silicon Valley Bank. Some of you may not even have heard of it. But if you work in the American startup space, you know this bank is a big deal. Silicon Valley Bank, or SVB, is the banker to the American tech industry. It was opened in 1983. So Silicon Valley Bank worked with American startups, and it was among America's 20 biggest banks. Now it has collapsed. The question is why? And this is the interesting part. For a bank serving the tech industry, the SVB collapsed in a rather old-fashioned way. There was a bank run. People were taking out their money. The bank could not pay its depositors. It went broke, and so regulators had to shut it down. Next question, why could it not pay its depositors? Where did the money go? You could say this was a perfect storm. It began when the pandemic hit. The internet became the world's lifeline. So tech companies made money. They became more valuable. They grew in size. They raised funding. And where did they take this cash? The funds that they raised, where did they put this money? In the Silicon Valley Bank. Just look at the numbers. Between 2020 and 2022, bank deposits at SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, tripled. From $62 billion, they jumped to around $175 billion, which means Silicon Valley was flush with cash. And these were not complex deposits. It was just money lying in a bank account. Think of it like your savings account or a fixed deposit. These tech companies trusted SVB to take care of their cash. And what does a bank do with its cash? It gives out loans. That's how banks make money. They take cash from depositors like you and me, and they use this money to give out loans. They charge an interest on the loan, and they give depositors a smaller interest. The difference is the earning of the bank. That's how it works. Basically, banks charge a higher interest on a loan that you take from them and give a smaller interest on the money that you deposit with them. The difference is theirs to keep. So this bank, SVB, was sitting on a massive pile of cash. It had to pay interest to its depositors. And like any bank, it gave out loans. Do you know who got these loans? The American government. The SVB bought government bonds, US treasuries. It's the safest form of investment in the world. But for this bank, it turned out to be a mistake. Last year, when fears of a recession grew, the US Federal Reserve, that's America's central bank, hiked interest rates. This made these US treasuries less attractive. Their value went down. So SVB took a major loss on its holdings. And around the same time, something else was happening. The tech sector was also in crisis. The fear of recession dried up their funding. So these tech companies began dipping into their savings. They went to SVB and they withdrew their deposits. They took out their money. Do you see what was happening? The Silicon Valley Bank was being squeezed. On one hand, its investments were in a loss. On the other, its customers wanted their money back. The bank needed cash, so it decided to dump some of its bonds. This caused a loss of $1.8 billion. Suddenly, everyone was nervous. Next thing you know, SVB customers began lining up outside the bank. They all wanted their money back. By then, it was too late. The bank was insolvent. It was out of money. The regulators had to step in. They had to shut down the bank. This is the second biggest bank failure in the history of the US. SVB's customers are in distress.
We can't pay our vendors today. What happens when tens of thousands of companies can't pay their vendors anymore because they don't have cash in the bank? we're facing something much more than just my company potentially collapsing, but something economically very dramatic.
The British government is concerned too. That's because Silicon Valley Bank had a presence in the UK as well. HSBC acquired it today. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is visiting the US. When he arrived, the bank failure was the first thing he brought up.
Well, I understand the concern that people have got around what's going on with Silicon Valley Bank. That's why I've been working with the Chancellor all weekend and indeed on the plane flight over, talking to the Bank of England and our regulators about finding the best solution. The government will have more to say on this very soon, but what I want to reassure people is that we will continue to support our world-beating tech sector and all the high-class jobs that it provides, but also that our financial system is resilient.
And that was just one part of the crisis. On Sunday, part two played out. US regulators were seen in action again. They shut down another bank, Signature Bank in New York. It is in no way related to SVB. Signature was already a distressed bank, but what happened at SVB precipitated its fall. Signature Bank had made bets on the crypto market. It suffered major losses. The bank had lost 40% of its value. Its owners were looking for a buyer. They were trying to shore up their finances, but they failed. So the regulators had to step in again, and the headlines went from bad to worse. Signature is the third biggest bank failure in American history. What does the US government say? The US Treasury Secretary is concerned.
You mentioned Silicon Valley Bank. There are recent developments that concern a few banks that I'm monitoring very carefully. And when banks experience financial losses, it is and should be a matter of concern.
This is indeed a matter of concern. There is now a crisis of confidence. American banks have recorded major losses. Their stocks have nosedived. Last week, US banks lost $100 billion in value. European banks also saw losses. Their value declined by at least $50 billion. And what about the depositors? The good news is they will get their money back. That's because the deposits in these banks are insured. In fact, SVB depositors were supposed to get their money today. Those Signature Bank customers will have to wait, but they too will get their money. That's the assurance from Washington.
Americans can have confidence that the banking system is safe. Your deposits will be there when you need them. Small businesses across the country, the deposit accounts at these banks can breathe easier knowing they'll be able to pay their workers and pay their bills. And their hardworking employees can breathe easier as well.
But is that enough? What about the American banking system? There are doubts about its health now. The global markets are feeling the jitters. Asian markets opened in the red today. Indian markets suffered losses. Of course, there were other factors contributing to this. But the bank failures in the US dealt the worst blow. So should you be worried? Experts say while the developments are worrying, this may not be a repeat of the Lehman crisis, not yet. In the meantime, New Delhi is watching the developments in Washington. India's State Minister for Technology spoke out yesterday. His name is Rajiv Chandrasekhar. He will meet Indian startup founders this week. India will assess how the failure of Silicon Valley Bank may impact Indian startups. This is a developing story. We'll be tracking it for you. And now let's talk about the BBC, the national broadcaster of the United Kingdom. It seems to be making more news than reporting it. You know, like gonzo journalism, BBC style. In case you're wondering what is gonzo journalism, it's when a reporter is no longer an observer, but an active participant in a story. The BBC has aced it. Here's the latest controversy with an unlikely protagonist. Former English footballer and sports broadcaster Gary Lineker, the BBC's highest paid presenter, the host of a highly popular football show called Match of the Day. The controversy started, like most things nowadays, with a tweet. Lineker slammed a tweet by the UK government. It had a video message by Home Secretary Suella Braverman.
Enough is enough. We must stop the boats.
She was justifying the government's controversial migration policy. They're calling it Stop the Boats. Basically, it's a policy aimed at stopping illegal immigrants, deporting them to their home country or a third country like Rwanda. The policy is quite controversial. The Home Secretary was justifying it, and Lineker's response was typically British. Let me tell you what he said. I'm quoting. Good heavens, this is beyond awful. He then went on to compare it to the rhetoric of Nazi-era Germany. Now, here's something I must tell you. Lineker's criticism is not unique. A lot of people in and outside of Britain have slammed this bill. The United Nations, for instance, said this bill will make Britain an outlaw. And Lineker slammed it too. He did this on his own Twitter page, not the page of the BBC sports show that he hosts. So this tweet basically was in no way connected to the BBC, nor did it involve them. But the preachers of impartiality just couldn't stay out of it. The BBC forced Lineker to quote-unquote step back from his duties as a presenter. Why? Because he apparently breached the BBC's guidelines on impartiality. Yes, the word they love to use, a little too conveniently, we say. This time it backfired. Lineker was taken off air. The BBC, which has long been criticised for serving the government's agenda, said that he'll be put back on the show, but only after, and I'm quoting, only after an agreed and clear position on his use of social media. What followed was a storm. The staff backed Lineker. Many other presenters and commentators refused to show up for work. On Sunday, the BBC's radio and TV coverage was badly hit. They were forced to scrap a large part of their weekend soccer programming. And this is right in the middle of the Premier League. Talk about a self-goal. The leadership is under pressure. There's severe public backlash. But the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, has refused to resign. It was his decision to take Lineker off air. Now, the row has reached 10 Downing Street. Remember, the BBC is a public-funded broadcaster, but Prime Minister Rishi Sunak does not want to enter the story. This is what he said, and I'm quoting again. I hope that the current situation between Gary Lineker and the BBC can be resolved in a timely manner, but it is rightly a matter for them, not the government. Interestingly, the Prime Minister did not forget to praise Lineker as, and I'm quoting, a great footballer and a talented presenter. So the government does not want to get dragged into this dispute, which leaves us with the broadcaster, once again exposed for its hypocrisy over impartiality. When BBC's boss Tim Davie took office in 2020, he declared a war on woke. What does that mean? A conscious attempt to tackle perceived left-wing bias. But the Lineker incident has exposed them again and given fresh ammo to critics who say the organisation is too close to the ruling party, the Tories.
The BBC is not acting impartially by caving in to Tory MPs who are complaining about Gary Lineker. They've got this one badly wrong, and now they're very, very exposed, as is the government, because at the heart of this is the government's failure on the asylum system.
Now, a sports presenter has been taken to task for his political views. You may remember that BBC offices in India were recently raided. This was over tax irregularities, but they painted it as an attempt to gag free speech. The same Tim Davie, the BBC boss, wrote an email to his staff then. He said, and I'm quoting, "Nothing is more important than our ability to report without fear or favour." Well, what happened now? Why can't Gary Lineker speak without fear against the UK government? Or does the rule only apply to former British colonies? Meanwhile, the chairperson of the BBC, Richard Sharp, is currently facing 2 investigations. He's accused of doing favours to former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in exchange for his job as a BBC chair. This turn of events is brutal. The BBC loves to preach. It talks about impartiality, speaking truth to power. It runs biased documentaries based on allegations which have been dismissed by the Supreme Court of India. It's like the broadcaster is running its own kangaroo court. But when the story hits home, it is quick to silence critics. This controversy has put them on the back foot. An agreement has been reached with Lineker. We're told he'll resume his duties from this weekend, but the BBC's dented reputation has taken another hit.
An Indian becoming a UK PM.
Well, it's not like that we are going to get the Kohinoor back. But at least India is on its way to the top, huh?
But Gautam sir, there's actually not much to celebrate.
Why not? An Indian is ruling the UK.
Indian leaders in third countries often tend to overcompensate for their minority handicap.
Key.
For example, Sunak's Home Secretary of Indian origin, Suella Braverman, disapproved of India-UK free trade because it would encourage people immigrating to the UK, and the majority of whom were Indians. Structurally, India and UK have passed baggage, but still hasn't been resolved. And that is why,
Ladies and gentlemen, India needs to significantly temper its expectations from Rishi Sunak. Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.